Imagine a man who could swing a 10-pound hammer thousands of times a day without protein shakes, gyms, or push-day, pull-day routines. Now imagine he wasn't an athlete, but a medieval blacksmith, whose everyday job built strength modern lifters can barely comprehend. Chapter 1: The Hammer. That built strength, a life of relentless labor. Imagine stepping into a medieval village at dawn, the sun barely touching the rooftops, the world still half asleep, yet one place is already alive: the blacksmith's forge. Before the roosters crow, before the baker lights his ovens, before the market stalls open, the blacksmith is already at work, sweat forming on his brow, and his hammer raised for another long day. For a medieval blacksmith, strength wasn't a hobby. It wasn't something to work on. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival. Every muscle they developed came from necessity, not choice. Their strength wasn't built by motivation, it was built by the demands of the forge. Walk inside that dim, smoky workshop. The air is thick with heat radiating from a roaring charcoal fire. Sparks leap like tiny meteors every time metal meets metal. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of hammer against iron is as steady as a heartbeat, his heartbeat. And it will continue for hours upon hours. A modern gym athlete trains maybe 60 to 90 minutes a day. A blacksmith could swing a heavy hammer for 8 to 12 hours, without breaks, without timers, and without music pumping in the background. Their forge was the gym. Their hammer was the barbell. Their raw, physical labor was the workout, one they couldn't opt out of. Now picture the hammer itself. Not a lightweight steel hammer like today's tools. These medieval forges used iron hammers weighing anywhere from 2 to 10 pounds. And unlike a gym where you perform neat, clean sets of 8 or 12 reps, a blacksmith repeated the same swinging motion thousands of times a day. This constant repetition carved strength deep into their bones. It built forearms like braided rope. It thickened wrists to the size of small tree branches. Their shoulders were rounded and powerful, not from lifting dumbbells, but from controlling unpredictable, heated metal under immense pressure. Imagine gripping that hammer. Your hands heat up. Sweat slides down your palms. The wooden handle rubs your skin raw. Within minutes, you'd have blisters. Within hours, you wouldn't even be able to lift your arm. A blacksmith did this every day, often starting from childhood. By the time they were 18, they had the physique of someone who had trained for decades. Not for aesthetics, not for looks, but because their bodies adapted to a brutal, repetitive reality. And the metal they shaped, it didn't behave like modern manufactured steel. It fought back. It resisted. It forced them to adjust their stance, shift their weight, and use their whole body to direct force through the hammer. Their legs braced. Their core tightened. Their back strained. Their lungs burned from the smoke and heat. Every strike was a full-body movement. A blacksmith didn't measure strength by how much they could bench. They measured it by whether they could shape a stubborn piece of iron before it cooled. If you failed, you weren't redoing a rep. You were ruining a tool, a horseshoe, a weapon, something someone needed. Strength was endurance. Strength was grit. Strength was the will to keep hammering even when the world felt like a furnace. By midday, the gym athlete would be sipping a protein shake. By midday, the blacksmith was just getting warmed up. And yet, this is only the beginning. Beyond the hammering and the heat lies something even more staggering, something modern lifters would struggle to comprehend. Because the real secret of a blacksmith's strength wasn't the work itself, but the never-ending nature of it. So how long did they work? And how did that workload transform their bodies into powerhouses without ever stepping into a gym? That's exactly what we uncover next. Chapter 2 of Strength Without Rest, the work week that broke bodies. If Chapter 1 showed you the hammer, Chapter 2 introduces you to the punishing schedule that swung it. Because when we imagine medieval blacksmiths, we often picture the fire, the anvil, the sparks, but not the most brutal part of all. They almost never stopped. Today, when someone trains seriously at the gym, they talk about rest days, muscle recovery, split routines, and active breaks. For a medieval blacksmith, these concepts would have sounded like fantasy luxuries for people who weren't fighting to survive. A work week from another world. Let's step back into that forge, not to mark a break, but to announce another day of relentless labor. Blacksmiths commonly work 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And sometimes even on the 7th day they'd be called in for emergency work, repairing a farmer's broken plow before the next morning, fixing a knight's armor, shoeing a horse before a long journey. There was no weekend getaway, no after-work relaxation, no gym session scheduled at 7 p.m. Their entire life was the gym session. The body never truly rested. Modern athletes carefully control how much they lift. A blacksmith had no such choice. If the village needed nails, tools, swords, hinges, chains, locks, or horseshoes, the blacksmith forged them, and forged them, and forged them. Imagine a customer walking in mid-afternoon with a broken farming tool. The blacksmith can't say, "Sorry, today is my leg day. Come back tomorrow." He must repair it that day, often working into the night, the forge glowing like a second sun in the dark. This constant cycle meant their muscles never had a full recovery period. Their strength wasn't built in a structured, optimized way. It was forged through exhaustion, through repetition, through the sheer volume of labor forced upon them. Carrying coal, water barrels, metal rods, and heavy iron tools, a daily farmer's walk with unpredictable weight distribution, standing all day on hard floors, a constant strain on calves, knees, and lower back. And unlike the clean, controlled weights at a gym, heated iron resisted, twisted, and fought back. This wasn't fitness training. This was survival training disguised as labor. No ergonomics, no safety gear, no relief. Blacksmiths did all of this without ergonomic hammers, padded gloves, reinforced footwear, breathable clothing. Their bodies absorbed every impact. Their joints took every shock, their tendons strained daily, their spines bent under decades of load. The result, dense forearm muscles, powerful shoulders, thick wrists. A blacksmith's daily workload was so high that if you tracked it on a fitness app today, the numbers would look impossible. Pain was not a symptom, it was a companion. Ask a modern athlete about soreness after a tough workout. They'll talk about DOMS, recovery supplements, stretching routines, burnt fingertips, strained shoulders, aching joints, raw hands, stiff backs. These weren't injuries. These were their default state. And yet, their bodies adapted. Their endurance levels rose to inhuman standards, not because their training was efficient, but because it was unavoidable. And still, their strength needed fuel. How many calories did they consume? And why did their simple medieval diet fuel such extraordinary strength? To answer that, we step next into the taverns, kitchens, and markets of the Middle Ages, because behind every hammer strike was a meal that kept the fire inside them burning. Chapter 3. The diet that fueled iron, what blacksmiths actually ate. If you've ever wondered how a medieval blacksmith survived swinging a heavy hammer, massive amounts of energy packed into simple medieval meals, because while a modern gym athlete carefully tracks macros and protein intake, a blacksmith didn't count anything. He ate what he had, and astonishingly, it was exactly what his brutal lifestyle required. Let's step into his world. A breakfast that started with heat, not flavor. Imagine the blacksmith waking before sunrise. Most days, he grabbed a chunk of dense, whole grain bread. It was fuel, pure carbohydrates, fats, and salt to push him into the first hours of labor. Remember, he's about to stand in front of a furnace for half the day. He needs every calorie. Lunch, the meal that kept the hammer moving. By midday, the forge feels like an oven. Sweat soaks his tunic. His arms tremble with fatigue. His stomach growls like a furnace craving its own fuel. Lunch in a medieval village wasn't fancy, but it was dense. Imagine bowls filled with barley or wheat porridge, stews of beans and peas. Medieval bread and porridge were far more nutrient-dense than their modern versions. Protein more than you'd expect. We often imagine peasants eating tiny scraps of protein. But blacksmiths weren't ordinary villagers. They were essential craftsmen. Their labor was too important, valuable. This meant one thing: they ate better than the average peasant. Not like nobles, far from it, but blacksmith families had more consistent access to pork, fat, beef scraps, eggs, cheese, while modern athletes swallow protein shakes. Medieval blacksmiths unknowingly consumed high-protein meals packed with fats their bodies desperately needed. Fat wasn't seen as unhealthy. Fat kept you alive in the cold and fueled long hours of labor. The tavern meals where calories became community after an exhausting day of hammering metal. The blacksmith often visited the tavern not to party, but to refuel. Picture a noisy wooden room. Firelight flickering against ale mugs. Stew pots simmering in the corner. The blacksmith sits heavily at a table. Exhausted but hungry. What does he order? A hearty bowl of beef and barley stew. Ale in the Middle Ages was liquid bread packed with calories, yeast, and nutrients. While modern athletes avoid alcohol for recovery, medieval men used ale as hydration and nutrition. It was a drink and a meal in one. How many calories did they eat? We don't have exact numbers. His daily calorie burn exceeded that of most modern athletes by a massive margin. He wasn't training for a competition. His everyday life was the competition. Resilience built from the inside out. This diet wasn't clean, optimized, or scientifically designed. But it was high-calorie, high-fat, and it perfectly matched the lifestyle of someone who worked in extreme heat, carried heavy loads, constantly moved, and rarely rested. Their bodies evolved to burn through fuel like furnaces. Their strength wasn't a miracle, and that's exactly where we're headed next. Chapter 4: The Pain, the Scars. And in trained endurance, stand close to a medieval forge for just 5 minutes, and you'll feel it: the burning heat, the sting of smoke in your eyes, the pressure of the air thick with ash. Now imagine living in that heat for decades. Strength alone didn't make a medieval blacksmith powerful. Their true edge, the thing that separates them from modern gym athletes, was something harder, rougher, and carved into their flesh. Endurance built through pain, not trained, not learned, not optimized, just endured. Every scar, every burn, every swollen joint was a chapter in their lifelong transformation. The hands of a blacksmith. Tools forged from flesh. Look closely at the hands of a medieval blacksmith and you'd feel an easy, thick, cracked skin, calluses the size of coins, knuckles that looked carved from stone. His palms were armor, natural, hardened armor. Those hands didn't look strong. They were strong. They were the kind of hands that could crush a modern grip trainer without blinking. Burns, a daily tax of the profession. Modern lifters treat a blister like a setback. A burn, that's an emergency. For blacksmiths, burns were background noise. Tiny sparks landed on their forearms, leaving red dots that faded into scars. A misplaced hammer strike could send a hot fragment flying. The forge itself radiated enough heat to redden their skin after hours of exposure. Some days, their arms were so peppered with burns that they looked like maps, constellations drawn in blackened marks. But instead of stopping, instead of resting, instead of seeking medical attention, they kept hammering. Pain wasn't an interruption. Pain was a colleague. Joint damage, and the strength behind it. A modern athlete works in terms of sets and reps. A blacksmith worked until the job was done. Sometimes that meant thousands of hammer strikes, holding 15 to 20 pounds of iron with tongs twisting their wrists constantly, but their strength was real, raw, and ready for work at any moment. Breathing smoke, building a different kind of endurance step. Inside that forge again. The smoke from burning charcoal isn't like the air-conditioned breeze in a gym. It's heavy, oily, thick, sometimes toxic. Their stamina became relentless. While modern athletes train their cardiovascular system with treadmills and rowing machines, blacksmiths built endurance simply by surviving their workspace. By noon, most people would be wheezing. The blacksmith, he was just getting started. Mental endurance, the strength behind the strength. Perhaps the most underrated part of medieval blacksmith toughness wasn't in their muscles at all. This created a psychological toughness modern athletes rarely encounter. There were no good days and bad days. There were only days you worked, and days you worked harder. Blacksmiths endured constant risk of injury, constant noise. And despite all this, they showed up every morning, not for medals, not for records, not for aesthetics, but because the village depended on them, the night depended on them. Every injury became adaptation, every bruise became resilience. Blacksmiths weren't just strong, they were unbreakable in ways modern athletes can barely imagine. And that's exactly what we explore in the next chapter. Chapter 5: Medieval Strength versus Modern Gym Strength. A shocking comparison. Picture this: a modern gym athlete walks into a medieval forge, clean shoes, shaker bottle in hand, muscles sculpted under perfectly fitted gym wear. He trains 5 days a week, tracks macros, logs reps, and knows his exact personal records. Across from him stands a medieval blacksmith. Let's break it down. Aesthetics versus function. Two different worlds. Modern gym athletes often train for appearance or specific controlled lifts, bicep curls, bench press. These movements isolate muscles or use controlled ranges of motion. They're optimized, safe, repeatable. Blacksmiths, on the other hand, trained without realizing they were training. Their strength came from awkward loads, imperfect leverage, unpredictable resistance. When a modern lifter pushes a barbell, the weight stays balanced. When a blacksmith swung a hammer, the metal fought back. When a modern athlete lifts with perfect form, a blacksmith lifted with whatever form kept him standing. They held burning tongs, slippery iron rods, and they did it for hours without gloves. Their forearms were massive. Their wrists were thick. Their fingers were like iron branches. It was forged endurance, the most overlooked strength. A modern gym athlete trains in 45 to 90-minute sessions. A medieval blacksmith worked 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. This means their stamina was far superior, their recovery tolerance was higher. If modern athletes trained in a room reaching 1201-600 C, they'd pass out in minutes. Blacksmiths stood next to those fires every day. A blacksmith wouldn't outsprint a trained runner. He wouldn't beat a cyclist in distance, but in overall functional endurance: lifting, swinging, carrying, twisting, gripping for endless hours. He would easily overpower most modern gym goers. Core and back strength and insane power. Few modern athletes understand what it means to stabilize a twisting piece of iron being struck with force. Every hammer strike forced the blacksmith to brace his core, lock his hips. This turned every motion into a functional core workout. Carry 40 pounds of coal repeatedly through the day. Stabilize a writhing metal bar heated to 2000 F. The answer is probably not. The blacksmith didn't build six-pack abs. He built armor around his spine. Overall strength comparison. The truth: let's simplify it. Modern gym athlete wins in maximum controlled lift sprint ability. Time medieval blacksmith wins in real-world strength, functional movement, grip, and wrist durability. A blacksmith wouldn't beat a bodybuilder in a bench press competition. A bodybuilder wouldn't last 1 hour doing a blacksmith's job. Because modern strength is measured in numbers, medieval strength was measured in survival. The strength that modern life destroyed. The most shocking part: blacksmiths weren't unique. They were just one example of what human bodies used to be capable of. Farmers, builders, miners, sailors all had labor-based strength modern society no longer requires. Today, we lift weights to build muscles. For that answer, we head into the final chapter, the story of how our world changed and how real strength quietly disappeared. Chapter 6: The Final Collapse. When the ground itself became a weapon. Imagine standing on a medieval battlefield where the real danger no longer comes from arrows in the sky, but from the earth under your feet. This is where our story now reaches its climax, the moment when the tunnels dug in darkness finally decide the fate of everything above them. For days, sometimes weeks, miners worked like ghosts beneath the castle walls. The defenders knew something was happening, could feel it happening, yet had no idea where the strike would come from. This is where Chapter 6 begins. The attackers had dug their main gallery directly beneath the thickest, strongest section of the wall. This was by design. If the strongest point falls, everything else follows. Inside the tunnel, the air had turned hot, thick with smoke from torches. The miners were exhausted. Their hands were blistered, their clothes soaked through with sweat and dirt. They worked in conditions that modern people would call unbearable, yet to them, it was simply the job. And then came the signal from above: prepare the fire. This was the most dramatic and dangerous part of mining warfare. The attackers would prop the tunnel roof and walls with heavy timber supports. Then they stacked firewood, pitch, sulfur, tar, anything that burned hot and fast all around those supports. The goal was simple: create a fire so intense that the beams turned to ash, the ground collapsed, and the wall above sank into a crater. But that didn't mean it was safe, because once the fire was lit, the miners had minutes, sometimes only seconds, to crawl out through a narrow, twisting escape shaft while the tunnel buckled behind them. Outside, the army watched in silence. Siege engineers stood ready, shields raised, archers ready for the defenders' counterattack. The commander stared at the wall, with the intensity of a man watching fate itself unfold. Then it happened. A deep, guttural groan rose from the earth. Birds took flight. Stones rattled loose from the battlements. Defenders froze, gripping their weapons. A heartbeat later, the ground broke. The tunnel collapsed inward with a sound like thunder muffled under soil. Dust shot into the air like a geyser. Huge segments of the wall cracked, trembled, and then slowly, almost gracefully tipped forward. Within seconds, the strongest part of the fortress had become its weakest. For the attackers, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A breach meant opportunity. Sometimes the defenders countermined perfectly, meeting their attackers underground, turning the tunnels into chaotic melee chambers where men fought hunched over, barely able to lift their weapons. Sometimes the collapse failed, or even backfired, sinking harmlessly away from the wall. And sometimes, rarely, but terribly, the entire tunnel system caved in while the miners were still inside. Yet when it worked, it changed history. A single tunnel could decide the outcome of a siege that would otherwise take months. And sometimes, the earth itself becomes the deadliest weapon of the age.